Hello everyone. So today we are going to be in my pantry. It's a little bit different, but we're going to be looking at hand planes and most specifically at honing the blades from our hand planes. So the first thing that we have to talk about when we're talking about sharpening our hand planes is the difference between the bevel up and the bevel down blades, or the styles of planes, because there's different angles that you can sharpen your plane to, but in some cases that's going to have a big effect on the way that you cut, and you're going to make different choices based on that, and in other circumstances it's not going to matter as much. So this is a kind of pretty ratty old plane. I need to do a full kind of reconstruct of this, but just for example, this is one of these. It's a number 3 bench plane. And this is one of the ones that has the chipper on top, and you've got a your beveled plane blade is going to be on the bottom, and so the bevel is down when it's housed in the plane body, and so that means that the angle of the bevel, it doesn't matter as much because it's the angle that the plane sets for it. So the angle that is created by the frog and the mounting in the plane body is what's going to determine the angle that the blade is hitting it. Now, contrary, when you've got, for example, this is my number 62 Lee Nielsen, and I've loosened it up already. So with this bench plane, the bevel sits facing up, and so that means that if you hone the blade to a sharper or a greater or lesser angle, it's going to have an effect on the types of woods that you can efficiently cut it with. Again, pretty gummed up. So soft woods like pine, things like that, you can use a low angle and have them really cut nicely with that very fine blade. Hardwoods, like very hardwoods, are going to respond a lot better to a more to a larger angle. So the other thing that's going to affect the way that we want this to come out is what purpose we want to be using this for. So if you're doing just general surfacing, then generally you're going to want your plane blade set in a really square shape, like this. But if you're wanting to use this as your finishing strokes for a piece, especially if you're somebody who likes to avoid sanding and you like to just go for a plain finish, you might want to make sure that you have a camber on the edges of your plane blade. And all that means is that you've got the square blade, and then there's just a little bit of a curve, and this is exaggerated. There's a little bit of a curve. You wear down those corners a little bit while you're sharpening to ensure that when you're doing those finishing strokes on your surface, you don't have the edges of your plane blade digging in and leaving lines in your nice finished surface. So first thing that we have to do is our grind. So let's go to the grinder. So we're going to the grinding wheel now to grind the bevel on these blades, and we're going for something in the like 27 to 30 degree range for the angle that we want to put on this bevel. And you kind of want to, if this is your grinding wheel, you want to be aiming towards making sure that you're getting a clear run on the front of that bevel rather than riding on the back of it, because the whole point is we want this to be a fresh edge. And this is an 80 grit aluminum oxide wheel, and I don't have a slow low speed grinder. This, I probably bought this grinder at, you know, the Home Depot or whatever, one of these box stores. And so you just want to keep in mind that you want to be careful to not overheat your blades. Especially if you don't have a low speed grinder, you want to kind of go carefully and take little breaks. Something that's useful is that I'm doing a couple different blades at the same time, so I'm able to circulate between them if it's taking a little while to get the cut that I want. If you want the reference point, you can actually use a Sharpie just to show you really clearly. Depends on the condition of your blade, whether this is going to be really obvious or not, and also on your own vision, etc. But you can kind of paint that front edge of your blade, and it'll make it really obvious to you when you set it on the wheel. So you can brace your finger up against the guard here, and you just want to set, I don't know how well we can see, but you're wanting to set that wheel, and then you're wanting to move laterally. And just keep in mind, you know, I have a tendency to actually brace my finger underneath this guard, which I'm sure plenty of people would say is a safety hazard, but for me, I know exactly where my hands are if I'm braced here, and it gives me the traction that I need to move really cleanly. So for me, that works. Find what works for you. If you're going to be doing quite a bit of this, it's worth putting on a mask because it's a lot of pretty funky dust. And at the very least, you want to be wearing your glasses. I know there are guards on this, and when you really get into it, it can seem like not a very big deal. But sometimes these wheels can actually shatter. And it hasn't happened to me, but I certainly know people for whom it has happened, and it's not the most predictable thing in the world. And you want to make sure that you're reasonably well protected if you're doing that. Another thing that I would say is that same for the sharpening, same for the grinding, all of these things where we're working with metal, you want to be careful that you're not doing that on your normal workbench surface where you're doing your actual woodworking, because you end up with all of these little tiny metal filings that can be really insidious and get into your work, and it means that then you have that risk of a little metal filing ending up embedding into a piece of your work and then rusting and getting rust stains and these various issues. So let's have a look at this. Cold, my glasses are fogging up. The first thing that you want to do as your baseline is you want to make sure that you've flattened the back of your plane blade. Now, we do that with our chisels as well when we sharpen them, but unlike a chisel, you don't need to flatten the back of the entire plane blade. You kind of just need that front surface. Now, if this is an older plane blade for you, or something that you've which is to say it's coming to you used and it's old, or if it's a brand new plane blade, chances are good that you're going to need to start with a piece of float glass and cover that with sticky back sandpaper at 220 grit, and then use that as your initial flattening of the back. So you want to have a piece of rubber mat So even like the sort of heavy duty rubber matting that you get to put on your doorstep for your boots, or this is like a silicone baking tray, just something that's going to really lock stuff into place so that you're not sliding all of your kit around. And then I'm using the back of my diamond plate, which is pretty true. If you want to check your surface to make sure that it's true, remember the difference between a straight edge and a ruler. Just because something's a reasonably straight tool for measuring length, it doesn't mean that it's a really true edge that you can use to guide you to see if something is actually really flat. So this is decent. I like using a piece of float glass because that's a pretty reliable surface to work with as a completely flat reference, but I don't have a piece right now, so this is what we're on. So float glass or a reasonably good, as true as you can get flat surface, and then sticky backed 220 grit sandpaper. If you've got a very good manufacturer that you're getting a new plane from, like a Lee Nielsen, something from Veritas or one of these guys, then you can probably skip 220 and go straight to the 1000 grit. But especially with this one off of my dad's plane, we're gonna have a look at this and see how it comes out. So with the plane blade, it's not like a chisel. You don't need to flatten kind of the entire back of it. You just want to be covering the front. Okay, so now, because this is my plane blade that I've been using for a while, I'm going to start directly with the 1000 grit stone. We'll talk at another time about flattening your stone, but essentially these check marks are me saying to myself that I have flattened these stones, that they are true, and that's reassuring. So if I've been using the sandpaper and I'm going from sort of a right hand dominant scratch pattern, it can be useful to switch when you go up a grit to a left hand dominant so that you'll be able to see the scratch pattern contrasting to the one that was on there before it, so you can really clearly see when you've broken through. So heel first, then the front, and we're just going to If you're not accustomed to using the grinding wheel to create that hollow grind, it might seem strange to have a slightly curved bevel on your plain iron rather than straight. But if you think about it, having that slight concave means that when you're sharpening the bevel, you're really registering your stone against the very tip and the very back of the bevel. And so there's actually less material that you're having to hone. So you'll end up with this concave, and the very tip of it and the very back of it with a sort of the little bowl underneath are going to be the parts that get honed out and really made clear. So now we've done 1000 grit on the back of our plane blade and knocked that burr off the edge. And so this is the first time that we want to be bringing the bevel of our plane to the stone. And depending on what type of plane you have, it's going to be more or less challenging. There's the older plane blades that are quite thin and that it's a much more subtle sensation to find that nice registration where you feel the tipping point between the tip and the back of the bevel, versus one of these newer, very heavy plane blades where you've got so much material that it's very clear when you feel it really clearly. Now you can also use honing guides, so those are available and they're not terribly expensive, but I think there is something to be said for learning how to do it by hand. Obviously a honing guide is a totally valid way to sharpen your plane blades, so there's no shame in not doing it purely on sensation, but you're getting plane blade sharpening technique taught by the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship, and Kat Fink is just the conduit giving this to you. So I have little bits of my own opinion, but obviously everybody's going to have their own way that they like to do this. In any case, so it's the same thing. When you're flattening the back, you want to start by registering what's not the blade against the stone, and then tipping down onto it so that you're not digging into the stone, especially as you get to those higher grits. The stone is quite soft, so you can leave like big gouges in it. So same technique, same theory on the other side. You start at the back of the bevel, tipped back, and then you tilt up until you feel that register of the bevel, so you can feel that front and the back of the bevel. And with these narrow blades, it is more subtle, so you want to have relatively even pressure from one side to the other, and you just pull back. And if you want, same as on the grinder, you can put the marker on the blade to see if you're getting that where you want it to be, but you'll see that shadow come across the very tip of your bevel and at the back of your bevel, so that's what we're looking for. And you'll feel that burr. So the burr, it's that like little curl of metal that comes up on the opposite side of the side that you're working. So when you flatten the back, you'll feel that little burr come up on the bevel. And then as you're working the bevel, you'll be able to feel that little burr coming up on the other side. This isn't like, you're not gonna be like, oh, there's a hook of metal on the other side. It's a subtle sensation, but you'll be able to feel it. So now that we've got a nice polished area at the heel and the tip of the bevel, we can also switch back over to the back of the blade so that we're keeping that burr knocked down. So same thing, just knock that burr off a little bit. And so also at this point, if we're wanting to have this be our smoothing plane for doing really finished work, and we want to introduce that camber, that slight curve, this is the point where we would do that. And the way that that looks is just here at the stone. So it's not on the grinder, it's not a really extreme thing. We're talking like the amount that you diverge from a straight line is about half the thickness of a sheet of paper. So if you go any narrower than that, it's the difference between just having a shaving that comes off that gets really, really fine at the edges versus essentially just making your plane act as though it has a narrower blade. So if you add too much of a curve, you're just making your blade smaller. You're not kind of getting the desired effect. So the way it looks if we're adding a camber to this is you just are changing the pressure that you're applying to either corner of the blade. So match it up, you can count them out. So if I'm gonna do 5 strokes on either side, I'm gonna start same way, heel touches first, then the tip of the bevel, and I'm going to air the pressure onto the right side of the blade, and I'm going to do 5 strokes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see it coming through in the polish, but it's not like you've got a really strong differentiation. So same thing on the other side, you just switch the way that you're weighting the blade. And I'm doing several blades at one time here, so I actually have taken my stone in and flattened it during this process. So you want to make sure that you're keeping this point of reference as flat as possible. You can do, you know, one blade without needing to reflatten constantly, but check in with it and make sure. Okay, so now we've got the back and the bevel of our blades up to the 1000 grit. So it depends upon personal choice. For a lot of people and for what you're doing, 6000 grit might be perfectly adequate, and so you can go from 1000 to a 6000 grit as a reasonable one-step process to finishing this up. You also might prefer to go to a slightly higher grit. A lot of people prefer like 8000 grit. So if you're going from the 1000, you probably want to go 4000, then 8000. I'm going to just go from the 1000 to a 6000 grit and call it good for today. And that's up to personal taste. If you've got a preference or a favorite that I haven't mentioned, or one of these things that you think is like absolutely the way to go, tell me about it, because I definitely I'm learning here too. So same thing, now that we have the camber set into the blade, as we're continuing up through the grits, we have to continue with the camber. So first thing, I'm going to knock that burr off the back. Once you've come up to these higher grits on the back of your blade, you shouldn't need to go all the way back down to the really low grits. So it's reasonable to, once you've gone through this whole process and you feel that you've done a very good job of really cleanly flattening the back of your plane, you shouldn't need to go all the way back down. It'll save you time in the future as you're coming back through. So once you've done a very good job of this process, sharpenings should be a bit more quick. Get a little water on here. My check mark tells me that I've flattened this and that it's good to go. So I'm going to heel toe. Again, especially as you get into the finer grits on your stone, it's going to be easy to have those digs happen into the stone if you're not careful about making sure you go back to front as you're laying the blade on. So let's knock that burr off the back. The 1000 tends to be a bit of a dull look, and then as you're coming back into the 6000 or 8000, you're getting a nicer polished look to it. So then same thing with the camber. You want to alternate back and forth, and you want to be watching your scratch pattern just to see that you're clearing that old scratch pattern. So you think that you won't be able to see the difference. You're like, it's very small amounts of metal, looking at the very tip of that bevel and the very heel of it. But really the difference in that shine that you get when you get to the higher grits, it makes it clearer than you trust yourself maybe at the outset. So I'm gonna do a couple more strokes here. All right, so we've got some very nice sharp blades. Now, next time we're going to have a look at mounting them in our plane and tuning in the plane so that we're getting the best cut that we can. Thanks for tuning in for this, and we'll see you next time.